Light is the left hand of darkness, and darkness the right hand of light. Two are one, life and death, lying together like lovers in Kemmer, like hands joined together, like the end and the way.
Hey, this is Nick.
Hi, this is Stephanie.
This is Nathan, and welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. Today we're talking about Ursula K Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness. This book follows an envoy from space. Do we know what this planet is called?
Is Earth-ish. It's in the Hain universe.
It's in the Hain universe.
Ecumenical?
No, that's the group of...
Right,
yeah.
but that's like the union
Planet Council.
for which he is an envoy.
I think
of.
Winter.
Oh, Winter.
Is the
That's
name of the planet.
Thank
I'm
you.
pretty sure.
Winter's the planet that they arrive on.
Correct.
Yeah.
What was
Yes.
the question?
That was the question.
Oh, okay.
The question is how many fucking different names are there in this book?
Yeah, at least we can pronounce Winter.
Yes.
So
Yes,
he's on the
that's
planet of Winter,
probably
which
the
I think is
easiest.
colloquial, and he is trying to build a relationship with a nation on this planet so that the ship can land and bring them into the ecumenical council. Significant concepts in the book are that everybody on this planet is ambisexual at some points in the month, male at some points in the month, female, so to speak. Maybe we can get into that. And he spends a great portion of the book traversing the ice caps with his frenemy, Estravan,
And maybe love interest.
and possibly Brokeback Mountain love interest.
I was gonna reference that. Similar vibes. All right.
Okay, we're
A little
going
bit
there.
of an outdoors emotion kind of thing. My side of the mountain, possibly. Yeah. So I guess.
So should we jump in?
Yeah.
All right,
What do you want to talk about? There's a
Let's
lot.
do it.
let's talk about genre.
Like, are we into genre? Like, is this genre?
Like, is this genre bending or genre confined?
My goodness.
Steph?
Oh, so let's lay that one on me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's easy. It's probably a yes or no.
Okay. Well, I mean, it definitely is a science fiction book, obviously, but I think, to me, I've read quite a bit of science fiction. I think that might be why you pulled me into this podcast.
Yeah.
I'm like your resident science fiction fan. Yeah,
Exactly.
that's
Welcome.
cool. Okay, yeah.
You fit the stereotype.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. But to me, it is science fiction, but it's more like sociological in the way that it reads. I feel like she was more trying to make a point about with the different sexual beings on the planet, and then communism versus capitalism. Like, she was trying to make a lot of different points about the world that we live in today, and not maybe something that's far-fetched in science fiction. I don't know. Yeah.
I want to hear more about this because I've read some science fiction. I used to consider myself something of a science fiction fan.
Oh.
I kind of have decided that I'm not anymore.
Uh-oh.
But you showed us this fantastic chart of science fiction and like how it's
I hope we
spawned
show
out.
that to our listeners.
We can link to it, I
Okay,
believe.
we should do that. Yeah.
Maybe we'll get sales from it. We'll,
It's
you
a
know,
it's a
use
pretty cool poster. Yeah.
It's a good idea.
Yeah,
The history
we'll-
of science fiction.
on
yeah.
the back of a leftist, progressive, communist leaning writer. We'll profit off of
Okay, cool.
poster sales.
Yeah.
But
One way or the other. Yeah.
I think I have come to the conclusion that my perspective on science fiction is quite limited, and that I like a very specific kind of science fiction that is basically doesn't fall on that graph, which is that it's still focused on humans and characters, because I think a lot of science fiction really focuses much more on speculation or on the science or that kind of thing. And I realize that like once it starts getting into that,
So you don't enjoy the hard science fiction. I think that's typically what they call that.
Yeah.
When it's more technological.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so that's a good. So
And that's
for-
not this at all.
Yeah.
I mean, they
But
did, the Winter didn't even have the Industrial Revolution.
No,
right?
it's true, right?
But it's not hard science fiction, but it's hard speculative science fiction. Because the one thing that I did enjoy about I already let it go.
You have the floor.
One thing
Get on that
the one
soapbox.
thing I
Yeah.
enjoyed, because I did not enjoy this book, or The Dispossessed. But the one thing I did like was it's very anthropological. And I could sense that she did a lot of either research for this book or just had a wealth of knowledge about anthropology and a love for folk tales and all of this stuff. And so she invents this, pretty thorough world with a lot of mythology that frankly doesn't move the story along. So in a way, I kind of felt like this isn't a novel the way that a novel exists outside of
Yeah, it is
science
interesting.
fiction.
Her parents were anthropologists, I believe.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and
Her background.
so for reference to the listener, the chart we're talking about is a progression of sci-fi as it evolves and different, I guess, subgenres of it,
Right.
and speculative and hard
From
sci-fi and
fantasy to hard
fantastical.
sci-fi
and,
to
yeah.
cyberpunk. To,
So that's
yeah.
the question here is where this lands. And I think, so my take on this is, we talked about Dispossessed in the last podcast, not a huge fan, kind of in a similar boat for this book, but I have read a lot of interviews and conversations and sort of analysis on Le Guin, and I've kind of decided that I actually really like her ideas, but maybe not veiled in a fictional setting. But one thing she talks a lot about is the mechanism of sci-fi, because she basically kind of gave it up for a while. Like, she got a lot of recognition for Dispossessed and this book, and then she kind of just didn't feel like writing that anymore. She has a lot of things that are more traditional fiction. There's always a fantastical element or something that doesn't like fit perfectly into more of a contemporary realist thing. But she, perhaps ironically, was not really that big into genre, which is why she doesn't really like the genre title. And her biggest thing with sci-fi is it's not speculative. It's not about the future. These are just mechanisms that I get to access in order to think certain things through. Now, I'm not even sure that I agree with that, but that sentiment, I think, is an important thing. Yeah.
I agree with that sentiment. I don't.
I'm not sure I agree with the outcome,
Yeah.
because it does seem speculative,
It
and it's always
feels very much in line with that. I mean,
Yeah, and I think on that poster, it actually falls under the
Yeah.
speculative genre.
This is my biggest-
according to the person that made that,
Yeah.
the history of science fiction.
my biggest thing is, there are a lot of disconnects between what she sort of argues at a direct level when she's discussing these things, and if you just had this book in isolation, what you would potentially get out of it.
So you're basically saying what she said was that she just used science fiction as a vehicle to get across her sociological ideas about
Exactly.
humanity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in a lot of cases, she would even say that she wasn't necessarily, and again, this is a disconnect that I feel hugely, because if you read The Dispossessed, it seems like this is about one idea, and I have an idea, and I need to prescribe it. But what she
Yeah.
actually says is that she sets up these things, like she says, number one, like, my thing is being able to build a setting. That's what I'm the best at. And she's like, and then I just put things in motion, and I actually write and see what happens from that. And her talk, like, there's a lot of, honestly, one of the structural things I think are kind of cool, whether or not they're useful, but like the myths built into that, she would sit down and she would map stuff out. She would create like a planet. She would create maps. She would write these myths as sort of her foundation. It's kind of almost Hemingway iceberg theory-ish. And she would then use those to then write the book. But then the reason some of these got in here is she realized that they were so prevalent in helping to theoretically understand the characters that she would then just include them in the book. But she said there's actually a lot more of these myths and stuff that aren't in the book that were just for her own development to create the world before she made the thing.
Well, I think there's more books that are in this series, correct? That actually talk about the planet Winter, and there's
Yeah.
like a prelude and
The
I think
heinous
so.
cycle.
That's what it
and-
is, yeah. So I think more of those myths maybe propagate into other books.
Yeah, and she says it's kind of
yeah.
all connected. People always asked her, when is this done? Is it not done? She's like, it's a universe. It's never done.
Yeah.
There's always
Which
more.
that's what there's so many science fiction and fantasy authors that do that. Like, I won't get into it, but yeah.
But yeah, I think that, like, I keep referencing the disconnect is like what she says to me sounds great. And I'm like, man, I'm really into this. And then I think back of my reading experience and I'm like, less into it.
I mean, I think I'm going to kind of tangent off of this just a little bit, but I think, when did she write this book? When did it come out? Like the late 60s, I believe?
This was, I think, 69.
Okay. So it's just interesting, again, when you look at the timeline of science fiction and you think of these authors that came before her out of the United States, like there's like Isaac Asimov and then Robert Heinlein. It's kind of funny when you go back, I've honestly never been able to get through a Robert Heinlein book. They're just kind of garbage to me. Like White Man Conquers Universe, I think is actually what Le Guin calls those. Yeah. And then I actually went back and reread the Isaac Asimov Foundation series, which is something I read in high school and I really enjoyed.
How's that hold up to you?
Yeah, exactly. It was one of the first things in sci-fi I read because my dad had given me his book of like short stories in high school and I just loved it. And then so that was like where my science fiction enjoyment started. And then I went back and reread the Foundation series a couple months ago and oh my goodness, it did not hold up whatsoever. It was
tacky.
It was very the use of women in the book. It was just like the concepts and ideas just they're not relevant in this day and age, I guess, to put it bluntly. Whereas you look at something like what Le Guin wrote, and it was just, back in that time period, it had to be so refreshing for so many people to get to read something that was science fiction, but actually included all people of the human race and not just like white man takes over universe sort of thing.
But the funny thing about that to me is that I felt like the book, and you could chalk this up to the narrator, but I felt like there was actually a lot of sexist assumptions. I can read a few.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Because I mean, you think that the premise of the book. I mean, one, the narrator is a male. There aren't any women in it. All of these ambisexual creatures. I mean, she refers to them as he, but they also seem to be mostly men-ish most of the time. I do agree with
that. Yeah.
But then the narrator also says things like, I mean, he's not speaking, but this is in the text, something like, he had a girl's quick delicacy in his looks and movements, but no girl could keep so grim a silence as he did. Or, this is just a fragment, had no standards of manliness, of virility to complicate his pride. I think this was in referring to like how these ambisexuals weren't like held down by these things that were natural to men on Earth. And I was like, this doesn't seem to be especially.
I think that is a really curious thing. And that like is definitely a vibe that I had. And I was like, what is the deal with this? This is always is labeled like this is the feminist sci-fi stuff. And then I started reading more and more about like Le Guin's approach and her relationship with feminism. It actually kind of makes sense. So there's a question here. So this is an interview done with Le Guin asking about a story she had recently had in the New Yorker. And the interviewer asks, why is it that most of your protagonists are male? She goes, I don't know. Yes, I've certainly been asked it, and I've tried to answer it, and I've given up trying to answer it. In the crudest sense, it's that all protagonists doing the kinds of things that I had in mind doing were male, and it took an effort of the imagination which I wasn't capable of making until very recently to change that. This is going to look rather odd in print, but it really doesn't matter to me very much what sex people are. And this is my main problem as a feminist. Every now and then, I forget to be upset. And then the interviewer responds, and I think is relevant. It says, well, Flannery O'Connor said that she always knew that there were two sexes, but she guessed and she behaved as if there was only one. And so I think there's actually a really like cool relationship with Le Guin's feminism. And she talks about it a lot, which is that oftentimes revolutions are, they leave people out. And so Le Guin was a housewife. She raised kids. And she actually felt on the outside of traditional kind of like aggressive feminism. I don't know if that's a proper term, or we'll just say more militant. We'll go with that. So she felt oftentimes excluded from that and would hate the bounds and the constraints that the theoretical feminist of the 60s and 70s was supposed to do. And so that's the cycle and the loop that I asked myself, is that's what's going in here? Is she intentionally doing that because, like she said, she was just used to males being protagonists, and she talks about how it's easier to just fit into that and then surround them with this other things that she's talking about. I also wonder, is she doing that for the reader to make it fit in, to make it accessible, like all those questions. But it does kind of fit in. When you hear Le Guin's name, you think that this is a strong, like maybe like, 60s, 70s politics, feminist kind of person. And while she is very active and certainly fits into that, I don't think it like fits into it as a puzzle piece that a lot of people expect.
It's a variant form of feminism. Yeah. it's kind of interesting. I watched an interview with her earlier today where she said when she was writing a lot of her books when she was younger and the children were younger, she would write at night. And then when they were out of the house, she was able to write during the day, starting at like 8 a.m. and then write for a good 5 hours and be done for the day. That was all she could do. But she was like, I was able to write when my kids were younger because I was lucky to have a husband that wanted to share the responsibilities with me.
Right.
Like she was kind of just saying it's normally the woman's role to raise the children. And if that's your role, then you can't have any other creative output or any other job. That's your job.
And her quote is that 3 people can always do 2 jobs, but 1 person can't do 2.
Yeah. But it's just kind of interesting her saying that I'm lucky that my husband was able or wanted to help me. Like she's like basically stating like it is the woman's job and it's not a dual job sort of thing. I don't know. I don't know if she
actually do you find, are you saying you find like negativity in that or
not negativity, just a different viewpoint on it. Like instead of like innately saying yes, it's the man and woman's job to raise the children together. She's basically saying yes, it's the woman's job first and then the man.
Actually, that's weird because that's not the context I got out of that. I thought she was just like being, I don't want to say like being realistic, but more so like, actually just being genuinely like appreciative, like for her husband in an environment where you look around and it was really not the case. So I don't think it was like, thank you for allowing me to be, a child rearing person. I think it honestly, it seemed very, I have a couple of quotes picked out too of like her relationship with her husband and how like basically as they're getting older, they would sit up at night and each person would have their glass of preferred whiskey or bourbon and they would read poetry and prose to each other. And like,
sounds lovely.
Yeah.
Sounds nice.
I was like, I'm going to star that for future life goals. But yeah, so I guess, yeah, I mean, that's honestly, that's the tension.
I mean, but I think that's what I'm kind of getting at is like her writing, like she just had like being raised maybe in the 40s and 50s. She just had a different viewpoint on the way men and women society worked. And that's like you're saying, like it was, she wrote mostly from a men's viewpoint. Like, yeah, you're right. All the characters were men and she used the male pronouns and things like that in the novel all the time. So I don't know. And it's interesting to label it as a feminist book when. Yeah.
Can I read one more quote on this?
No, please. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I'm probably not going to read that many quotes from the actual book. And I'm going to read more Le Guin quotes themselves because I find them to be more interesting. So this is talking about how she became a feminist.
What's the difference there?
A pheasant.
We're going to cut that. So this is clean cut. This is my lisp sneaking in. So this is talking about how she became a feminist in the early 1970s. And she says, it was a real mind shift. And I was a grown woman with kids, and mothers of children were not welcome among a lot of early feminists. I was living the bad dream. I was a mommy. There's always prejudice in revolutionary movement. I wasn't even sure that I was welcome, and I wasn't to some of those people. It took a lot of thinking for me to find out what kind of feminist I could be and why I wanted to be a feminist. And so I think that like tension is actually present in a lot of these sort of, like you said, like the pronoun stuff or descriptions, why the male protagonists. I think she's working through that as well. Like it doesn't have to be exactly this one thing. It can still have these other components.
Yeah, and I think she was more in this book objectively trying to look at what being a man or a woman does in your place in society. And so like, right. For example, at the end of the book, there's a quote, I'll read it here. I suppose the most important thing, the heaviest single factor in one's life is whether one's born male or female. In most societies, it determines one's expectations, activities, outlook, ethics, manners, almost everything. So I think it's just interesting to take a look at what it means as society to be either, and what if that didn't exist? What would our society really look like? And to me, that's such a great idea, but I don't know that I really saw it realized in this book.
I was gonna, let's get into this because
that's the meat.
Yeah,
because it's stated that she makes that statement. I kind of have this general critique of her that she has a tendency in these books to tell you what she means to show you, and then not really show it.
Yeah.
Like she tells you that this is super significant and that this story signifies how significant it is, And I'm like, well, it could have been two dudes. Like, it doesn't, it doesn't really make much difference. And I'm like, am I missing it? Or is this basically a planet of men?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like the whole plot line and things that moved things forward were the fact that Genry, am I saying that right? Genry.
Well, it depends whether you
Genry.
went
Genry.
Genly
It depends.
or Genry.
It depends if you're from Carhide or
right.
or
Depends how many
Orgarain, yeah.
mispronunciations
Oh,
of
my
made-up words
goodness.
you want to do
Okay,
right now.
yeah.
We have all day.
I'm going to go with Genry.
Okay.
I feel like it was always Genry unable to communicate properly with Estevan. I'm still going to say it Estevan because I prefer it that way. I don't even know how you guys say it the other way.
Estevan.
The Gathenians are all Spanish. They're all from Portugal or speak Spanish.
I think not what happens in Portugal.
Exactly. Damn it. It's not. I know. Damn it. Yeah. I don't know why I said Portugal. Damn it, Stephanie.
You're like, that sounds like a Portuguese speaking Spanish to me.
Yeah, exactly. That's what oh, wow. Please cut that. Yeah, David's listening to this.
Behind the curtain. We're more and more comfortable.
But I think it's their inability to communicate. And I feel like what she was trying to say was that they didn't communicate because Genry wouldn't look at Estevan as a human being. He couldn't see it as a ambisexual. He always had to make him or her a male or female, and then didn't trust them because of their sexual being. And so he refused to listen to Estevan when he was like, get out of Orgarain. He was like, no, I'm not going to. I'm going to head to these gulag camps instead in Russia, which, that's what she modeled this after. I mean, I just like that was the whole plot, but I never felt like I never felt like she really got across the fact that because Estevan was this ambisexual, why didn't Genry trust them?
Right.
Like what was there that made them untrustworthy?
I agree.
Right.
Like what about the sex?
I actually was like, why?
Well, there was the whole concept of shifgrethor, which I thought was actually the most important concept that she developed in the book, more important than the ambisexuality, which is
oh wow, okay.
I agree with that.
I don't actually, but go ahead.
Which is, I think, it's like I'm gonna butcher this word, guanxi in Chinese, which is like the maintenance of your relationships and kind of all that goes into that, and like saving face and how you present yourself, and like you don't
kind of a pride thing.
You're not too negative. Sometimes you kind of like try to manipulate the other person into a thing without taking a clear stance. And he couldn't. I mean, and I think this happens to a lot of Americans in China because you can't, or like business people, you can't say something directly. You've got to kind of like get around to it. And you've got to do all these other things before you can get around to it. And he doesn't know how, Genly doesn't know how to do that. He doesn't know at what point the shifgrethor stops and reality begins. And so he feels like everybody's just constantly trying to manipulate him, especially Estevan, who I gather is very good at shifgrethor.
Too good, apparently.
Yeah. Well, there's actually one scene where they play it out later on. And I really liked it.
They actually explain to each other why there was the miscommunication.
Well, it's when they after they've crossed the ice and they go into this town, and he's trying to convince the townspeople, the cook, to trust him without revealing who he is.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I'll just read this real quick, this dialogue. He says, "Silence is not what I would choose, or not what I should choose, yet it suits me better than a lie." And then the cook says, "It's well known that honorable men come to be outlawed, yet their shadow does not shrink," said the hot shop cook, who ranked next to the village chief in consequence, and whose shop was a sort of living room for the whole domain in winter. "One person may be outlawed in Carhide, another in Orgarain," said Estevan. "True. And one by his clan, another by the king of Erenrong. The king shortens no man's shadow, though he may try." And so they're like kind of speaking in these aphorisms, and never, it's kind of allowing them to have this conversation without him revealing that he's actually an outlaw, and that actually by talking to him, the other guy could be executed. But they have to like speak in these puzzles.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that that's inherent in one's sexuality.
Yeah, that's what was so weird to me, because I felt like it was almost like just a scapegoat to be like, well, shifgrethor, sorry, can't understand you. Like, I'm going to go about my own business. But like, was she saying that was more of a feminine aspect of the character?
I don't think it was attached to that. I read it more of just actually as sort of an anthropological type of question, like sort of code switching and like lost in translation and like in between societies that are inherently similar at, say a human level, but have these developed traditions that are really quite impenetrable. I mean, your example of, just businessmen, in a different country, like trying to operate, that's like continually difficult. And like the fact that you'll never be able to get to the same level of subtlety because you don't have all of those years of repetition and sort of being able to like tack and calibrate yourself to it. Because you also, another thing I thought was cool that was actually underexplored in this, but it mentioned every so often, is just the, so Genli grappling with that concept of what patriotism is.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I thought that was
country.
Cool. Like, what would it really be like if you never thought of a country as a patriotic thing? Because it's obviously such a hot topic right now.
What was that quote? Does it mean to hate your uncountry?
Yeah, exactly.
I thought that was great. Like, what is the antithesis of patriotism?
And that I think those sociological things I thought were, you referenced she does a lot of telling but not showing. I thought that those were actually showed a little bit more than the gender-related stuff. The gender-related stuff to me was almost just a detail that wasn't explored that much. That's
what I was going to say. Yeah, and I think I realized now, I read a couple of reviews online of the book, and some people say that the androgynous nature of the characters is more of just a fun idea to think about, but not relevant to the plot. And the more you guys talk about shifgrethor, that's, to me, much more relevant to the plot, because that's what caused the disturbances between the characters and moved the plot along.
It wasn't a spy novel a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it really wasn't the animosity between Ginri being a male and Estravan maybe being male or female. That never really, like, there's some aspects of the book where she says like, oh, well, it's because I couldn't see you as a human, I couldn't do this or that, but that's never really explored in the book. It's just one-off sentences that's told by the author.
But I also, I want to check myself with that, of how much is it me just picturing it in this manner because of the pronoun usage? Yeah. Right? Like, how much of it did I just attribute this to, like you said, a planet of males because of the pronouns? And so this, I think, is a really important thing to note. And so this is from an interview in 1976, where the interviewer says, I wondered about using the masculine pronoun, and I guess I thought, as you did, that there was no way around it other than making up artificial pronouns. And then Le Guin says, which I think you can get by within a short story, and apparently they don't bother some people, but at the length of a novel, and a serious novel, which is trying to make some point besides feminism, and I just think it would drive a normal reader mad. I really do. And I think it would really weaken the book. It weakens the language. You have to work with the language you're given, and thank God it's English. But I'm sorry we don't have a generic pronoun. It makes a great deal of difference. We're trapped with this he. Thank goodness for one, and you can use they a good deal. I don't mind they. I don't care what English teachers say. I think they is often a good road out instead of he or she, but you can't always use it. And so I think what's interesting and cool about that, even if we don't agree with those sentiments, is that in 1976, she was trying to figure out a gender-neutral pronoun.
Right.
What she chose, to me, I think ultimately made me visualize this book in an all-male way. Mm-hmm. But she was thinking about it.
Go ahead. I was just going to say really quickly, she made up so many words in this book. Why could she not make up one for a gender neutral? I mean, but that would, it really might have moved the needle on the androgyny. I mean, you know what I mean?
I think you just won this podcast. That's exactly
like
how
that would have just, why not? Like, why did she feel confined to that when she could make up shifgrethor? And
you're 1,000% right.
Yeah, that would have been the ace in the hole. I'm curious why she chose not to, because she must have thought to do it. I don't know why. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's a forever mystery.
There's an XKCD comment that basically has a plot that shows it's percent chance that a novel is good versus number of words that are made up in it.
Yeah,
amazing.
And I was like, well, yeah, all right.
I think another thing though that makes it hard to imagine that it's that they're actually ambisexual is that nobody that I can recall is doing anything that would be stereotypically female.
Right.
You're right. Yes. And there's a couple things where, like war, why is there no war? And she argues, is it because of no males on the planet, or is it just because it's cold as hell there?
Yeah.
And they don't have time for that. They're trying to stay warm.
They're eating all day because
Yeah,
they have
exactly.
to get their fuel.
They're like little ferrets. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that's a perfect example of that concept is super cool to ask. But she basically it's like a sentence in there rather than a
exactly,
whole
and
defining
that's what I
theme.
mean. All these fun things to think about just are not fleshed out, which maybe she didn't want to. Maybe she wants the reader to think about this and have podcasts that talk about it.
There's a chapter, I can't remember what it's called, but I think it's something like on sexuality or something like that. That's like kind of like tries to hit it on the head.
Well,
but it's just a paragraph, or it's just a chapter of kind of telling
it's chapter
you what
7.
to think
Yeah,
of it.
it's
The question of sex. That's what it's called.
it's interesting because this was almost like a tiny philosophical section that didn't fit into the rest of the book.
Right. But I don't even know that I buy it. I mean, so I highlighted a few things like, consider, a child has no psychosexual relationship to his mother and father. There is no myth of Oedipus in winter. Consider, there's no unconsenting sex, no rape. As with most mammals other than man, coitus can be performed only by mutual invitation and consent. Otherwise, it is not possible. Seduction is certainly possible. But I'm like, why?
Yeah,
why is any of this stuff? Like, I could imagine without much effort, all of these things existing in an ambisexual world.
I mean, another perfect example of explore that.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't think a
give
lot
me
of
some
people
more.
were putting this into writing in the 1960s. You know, these were maybe not new concepts, but concepts that weren't publicly available to the masses.
Right. And I mean, but there's a lot of territory there to explore. Like, what would an Oedipus complex look like in an ambisexual planet? But if it doesn't have any relevance to the plot, why even say it? Because to me, it's a lot of stuff like this that caused me to question whether or not I should take any of this seriously, because she makes what I think she makes claims as if they're matter of facts. And I'm like, I don't agree with that. Like, you could maybe try to prove that, but to just say it as a matter of fact, as if this is where we're starting from. It's like, well, obviously this is true. I'm like, well, wait, that is not obviously true to me. So wherever you go from here becomes increasingly far-fetched.
Well, I don't know if it was the author trying to make these facts, but a lot of these are like written reports. If you notice at the first of the chapter, it's some guy that was a field reporter. So I think she's trying to write it as like, these are just people that are, you know, subjective to their own biases, trying to comment on these societies and what they think, because there's a lot of different viewpoints that you could take on it. But I did want to talk about in this chapter, I've tabbed my book with a few different quotes, and this is my hell yeah quote, or hell yeah tab that I'd like to talk about. And it says, the quote is, "Everybody has his holiday once a month. No one, whatever his position, is obliged or forced to work when in Kimmer." So I just like to say that this society, everybody gets a week off every month to go have sex, and that's something we should think about.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be decreased productivity, but it would be increased
Exactly.
productivity, if you know what I'm saying.
Wink.
I mean, but actually, like, remember there's, I think in Japan, they would institute, like, go home and have sex.
Right, for populations that are declining.
Yeah, were overworked, and they would actually try to shut down workplaces so you go home and procreate.
I mean, it is just really interesting when you think about the animal species in general. Like, we're the only ones that don't like have a specific time of the month where we're all supposed to, like, we don't know it basically when we're all supposed to copulate, whereas like everybody else, like, kind of all the other animals are like, oh, this is it, this is our time, these are our, you know, couple hours where we need to go for it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. I think she tries to touch on that subject a little bit as well.
Would greatly simplify online dating.
Exactly. So what's your timeline? See, that's a fun thing to think about. We should write our own science fiction book.
We're going to write a science fiction book right now. It's going to be online dating in the world of Kemmer.
Exactly. Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's probably already taken. There's probably fan fiction on that.
Yeah.
We're dealing with sci-fi people here.
Okay, we can move along from that, but I just wanted to. That was one of my more enjoyable concepts.
I came here
of
to
the
talk
book.
about sex.
Yeah.
And
If we're not talking about Kimmer, then I'm out.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what else? There's good stuff in these conceptual things, but I don't feel like reading passages a lot. I don't feel like digging into this. And David had this quote when we were talking last time about the dispossessed, where he realized that like as we read more and more passages of books, it sort of indirectly shows how much we dig them, versus when we talk about things at this sort of like conceptual level, like you're trying to grapple with what is happening, that there is just no love of the prose, no love of the text. And that is actually one of my biggest questions. Is a lot of people attach like the level of categorization, all this stuff, of like saying that Le Guin is literary leaning sci-fi. You know, like all sorts of prominent like contemporary literature people are into Le Guin, and I don't get it. I don't think the sentences are special. I think they're clunky. I think her dialogue is pretty bad. And I even read an interview where she's like, "Oh, I don't write good dialogue. I don't have it. It requires an ear. That's not my thing. I try, but I just don't have it." So there is maybe a self-awareness to it too. But I grapple with that. Outside of these, are the themes developed or whatever? But people really saying that this is, you know, the blend of sci-fi and the literature. And for this book and for The Dispossessed, I just completely don't see it. I like don't have that emotion. I'm like not excited when I'm reading it. Like no sentences stood out to me. I'm just kind of like, eh.
I feel like it's always. I mean, I don't. You know, people can like this book. I don't care. But so I don't want to critique whatever anybody else thinks is nice about this book. But I feel like,
but we are.
But go on.
But whenever there's this sort of like, it's science fiction, and if we're holding science fiction to a lower standard by the nature of the genre, and it's saying like, it's a lower standard, but it's the better version of our lower standard.
I hate that people do that, though. Science fiction is not lower than literature. It's just
right.
it's just a part of literature.
Conceptually, I get mad at that, but when I read this, I'm like, well.
I'm inclined to agree with you. For me, reading this, I had to want it. Like it wasn't a leisurely read that I can say that I enjoyed. I enjoyed some of the themes and concepts and thinking about those on my own time. But like you said, the sentences, it didn't flow for me to read. And the made up words, the beginning of every chapter with the field reporter and the different dates and times, having those all different words.
All like, the days being
like,
different words.
It's not November, it's Orgogorin or something like
like I don't even know what day of the week it is, like, because I'm not gonna memorize.
Yeah, I was like, I just glossed over that.
Yeah, by the way, so she's
there's
like,
a whole like appendix to this too about how like the days are 24.02 hours long.
And to me, that didn't move any of her themes across.
Nothing. That's just science fiction. That's just pure genre.
Yeah.
Yes.
The best part about the Orgo rain thing is, so she was in Portland for a super long time, and people thought that it came from Oregon rain because she has a lot of these like attachments. And she was like, "Well, no, it's actually based on ogres." And I was like, "That's
naturally,
worse."
Yeah.
But I want to read one quote to kind of like, this is going to be the only quote I'm going to read for this book. It goes, "It is good to have an end to journey towards, but it is the journey that matters in the end."
Ladies and gentlemen, he just threw the book.
I read that and I was like, I'm not fucking doing this anymore. That's stupid. That's cheesy. That's like something like a sixth grader would write. That's in a bad movie. That's like, it's just, it's not good. Mm-hmm. And like, that's the emotion that I would have, is like, there's all these concepts that were kind of cool, not explored. But even if they weren't explored fully, she was still sliding stuff like that in. And I just didn't like it.
Yeah.
What really got me was in this and The Dispossessed, there, you know, it's kind of a drag to like, it's like reading a textbook a lot of the time. That's how I felt. And then a moment of intense violence happens, and that's like reading a textbook. And I'm like, all of this, like all these people just died or were stuffed into a truck and this guy starved to death, and I don't know what happened, but it's written with just a total vacuum of empathy for anybody involved in it. And I'm just like, why am I reading this?
Yeah. She's being too objective.
Yeah.
In her
I was thinking about that because I recently read Red Pony by Steinbeck. Not that these are related whatsoever, but I started reading it and I was like, this is a story about a boy and his pony. But I almost like cried at the end because that pony died, spoiler alert. And like that kid was like, but it like weaved together like so many like morality and like these big questions. And yet you can have a book where, like you said, just like a bunch of people die in it and all these big action things happen. And they're just, it doesn't touch on any of that.
Yeah.
There's like no connection for me. Like what's I'm pointing at my heart right now. It's not hitting me in the heart spot. And I just am like, I guess I'm bummed by that because there's no reason why it couldn't.
Right.
It just didn't go there.
I agree. Yeah, it's 2 books. I'm actually reading East of Eden right now. That's funny.
Oh.
Yeah, and it's kind of the same. Like there's really big themes that he's grappling with in that, and I'm reading that so much faster than I'm reading this.
Yeah,
and
it pulls you along. You actually just want to finish it
because there's not made up words for months,
Yeah.
and I don't have to flip to the appendix to look. Yeah, it's just interesting. And then I also think of like a Nabokov where in some of the books nothing really happens, but the writing is so beautiful that you're just completely hooked to it and you can't stop reading. It's so interesting how different authors can be and how they pull at your heartstrings, if you will.
They tug them, or they can if they choose to.
Yeah, and this just feels like a very dry science fiction novel, and science fiction doesn't have to be that way. But I think it's great that we had authors like this, especially a woman in this time period that opened the doorway for so many other science fiction writers. There's a lot of people that actually were influenced by Le Guin. Like, I know Orson Scott Card, which is actually funny. Like, the word ansible came from this book, and that I was like, I had read that, and I was like, where have I heard this? Because I was huge into Orson Scott Card when I was in high school, and I was like, oh my goodness, this was in Ender's Game and all those books. Like, people pull words.
What's the ansible in Ender's Game?
That's how you communicate.
Oh,
yeah, in hyperspace. Like with 0 time delay. Yeah.
Briefcase cell phone.
I wouldn't be confused if humanity ever gets around to inventing that or figuring that out. We might use that word, which is actually pretty cool because that's where it comes from. Yeah, it comes from this book.
Oh, wow.
So like Orson Scott Card, Neil Gaiman, there's just like actually even David Mitchell, the Cloud Atlas, which is one of my favorite books. She's a influence on them.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think it's like just the concepts that she introduced, maybe not so much her writing style that a lot of people pull from. And a lot of people actually say her Earthsea series, which is her children's books. I don't know if you guys, I haven't read those.
I read the first 3.
Oh, okay.
Also not a fan.
But do you like, did you ever read the Harry Potters? So that's where Harry Potter came from.
Yeah.
Wizard Boy. That's where all these ideas are.
I'm more okay with putting an asterisk on that, knowing that was essentially young adult fiction, and so that it's young adult fiction, but in my mind it's not really that different, and that's the thing
from her adult fiction.
Yeah, there's not a huge difference. And I want to also put a big old asterisk on that and say that I have read some of her later stuff, some of her short stories, and I actually do think that stuff is better. So part of the problem when I kind of come out and be like, I don't like this at all, is that I've read the first 3 books of Ursula, read Dispossessed, I've read this book, and I don't know if it's actually her best stuff, but it's the stuff that people know or connected with or influenced a lot. But maybe as a writer, she progressed beyond that. And that's how you're defined. It's like when you're in a band, whatever you make when you're 22, those are the songs that people like, but shit you made 20 years later is better.
I want to propose something about all of this, which is that maybe I'd never heard of Ursula K Le Guin, to be honest, before you proposed it. I realized that she's a big deal and somehow it just never
I actually found all of my books in somebody's like trash bin on the street.
And that's how you selected the...
Yeah, no, that's the one that I just threw across the room. That's from somebody's trash.
And that's where we get our book club ideas.
Yeah. We're very well funded.
Everybody asks, how do you choose your books? Well, here it is, folks.
I look through trash.
Next, we're reading Raccoons Are People Too.
So that maybe, like you said, I can't remember if we were recording about Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. Like it doesn't hold up that well, but I actually read Isaac Asimov in high school, and that's what kind of like got me into the science fiction also.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, these ideas are amazing. And maybe if I picked it up when I'm, in my 30s, I'd be like, it's not that interesting. But to read it like naively, like more like somebody who picked it up when it was published, like didn't bring any preconceived ideas to this. I was like, wow, that's opening up my imagination. Maybe if I had picked up Ursula K Le Guin in high school, it's like, wow.
I agree with that. It might have.
That was a common theme of the last episode.
That's really
but
interesting.
I can't pick it up now without all of the political commentary that goes with it.
Yeah, and if you have read science fiction, all that, you know what's good and what's out there, and there's so many more themes nowadays. I mean, it's just crazy how in, what was it, like 40 years, like 50 years, like we've come, like science fiction is just a genre all into its own, and there's so many facets of it that if you have read any of that, this could be a step backwards for you, potentially.
Yeah. Honestly, it's kind of like, do you appreciate something that spawned a lot of other things, but maybe it wasn't as finely tuned? You know what I mean? Like, like if you go back and listen to like really influential musicians and stuff, they were actually, their chops weren't as good. Like they weren't as refined in a way because people who were influenced by them kept iterating on that and kind of like improved it and brought like the level of quality better. But everybody loves these early points. But if you are just starting and you like look at them from an evaluation standpoint, the early points are just not as tight. They're not as well executed as some of this. I ask myself if that's part of what's going on here too as well.
Maybe to keep going on that idea, is what's the significance of a book like this to a agnostic reader who's not necessarily interested in the anthropology of science fiction?
So they would just be interested in the science fiction of the science fiction?
Yeah. Are they are they just a reader?
Just a reader looking for a book. Because, I mean, it's easy to look at any number of books and say that there's some academic value to it. To say like, hey, this did something in the course of history. But then I think it ceases to be a work of literature when it becomes that. It becomes a piece of history. It becomes anthropological.
Agreed.
And most of us readers are not writing a thesis. We're not, working on the anthropological history of science fiction and drawing a nice detailed poster of how it's branched out. We're looking for something else, ostensibly in a book. So is there? I think your analogy to music is good. I think comedy is another thing. Like sometimes I hear comics talk about old comics. And I'm like, oh, I gotta watch that. I'm like, this is not funny.
Yeah,
this isn't funny. But it means something to them, obviously, because they're looking at it from a much more conceptual lens and like appreciating their craft. So I can imagine, maybe somebody looks back on this and they appreciate, hey, in this period between 1968 and 1970, nobody had done this before, and she was the first one. But do the rest of us care?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the classic, like, school of criticism in which all things should be taken in a vacuum. They shouldn't be just connected. You should evaluate it for only being it. Yeah. And my opinion is if you do that with this book, it's not worth it. It doesn't hold up in a vacuum. There's a lot of cool links to shit, but like, would I tell a general reader that you have to go read this book? Absolutely not.
I mean, I think when I was reading it, I was kind of thinking of what science fiction themes she was trying to grapple with, and one of them was like the connection between aliens that are out in space, right? Like two different societies that meet together, and like maybe like the way that the evolution of humans. She actually touches on evolution quite a bit, like why. Like, how did these people come to be ambisexual? Or one thing that's not evolution, but that I thought was interesting was they never invented airplanes because there's nothing that flies on their planet.
Yeah.
Yeah, stuff like that was actually really interesting. But I thought of other books that also grapple with these themes. And like, to me, one that came to mind was the Hyperion series by Dan Simmons. Like, what would happen to humans if we did like genetically alter our DNA and then met millions of years later? What would that look like? So and that was a much more fun read.
CRISPR, it's happening right now.
And like
in the germline, it's going to be different.
No, that's what I mean. Like things that really could come to pass later. Like I said before, I just think in 40 years, science fiction and our technology has advanced so fast that there's way more things for us to think about. That like the idea of two aliens meeting, the idea of the ecumen is just kind of like, like, yeah, that's cool, but like we're past that, So I was trying to think of one other one. Yeah.
Have you read? I haven't read in a long time. Like Jules Verne.
Yeah.
What is he, like the first science fiction writer? Or
actually, it was
virtually?
Frankenstein.
Okay,
by
yeah.
Mary Shelley.
I guess if you categorize
It's
that,
Frankenstein.
It's I know I do that every time. It's Frankenstein.
Damn you, Mel Brooks.
but I mean, I think that's another good example. We still read that, and I mean, I haven't read it, but many of us read that in high school. It's a work of literature. I think when I read Jules Verne, it's been over a decade since I read Jules Verne. I enjoyed it. Like, it's very old fashioned, but there's still a charm.
That's true.
To the book.
Even Brave New World, right?
Even
Aldous
Brave New
Huxley,
World, yeah.
all those are still feel really relevant.
Yeah.
Actually, one I did want to bring up that I tried to reread was 1984.
Yeah.
To me, personally, that one didn't hold up as well. Like I mean, it's the concepts are great and interesting, but like the male-female relationships, again, that's how I felt about Asimov. Like these guys that are writing these novels back in the day, I'm just like, oh, this is awful. Like, you're just using this woman as a way to move the plot forward. She has no substance whatsoever. And it's just kind of interesting when you go back and try to reread some of those books. How they just don't hold up. Yeah. Compared to, are you a big 1984 fan?
I was. No,
okay.
I haven't picked it up in a long time.
Yeah.
But I've kind of fallen off that train a little bit, I think, just in terms of how he saw the future moving forward. I'm more of a Brave New World guy now.
Gotcha.
Choose your teenage dystopian novel wisely. It will define you forever.
But I think that there are examples of, those books are all older than this one, and they hold up to a degree. I mean, maybe. Again, I haven't read
to a degree,
these
sure.
books
And like I said, some of the ideas
time.
are interesting, but yeah, I mean, it's just the big thing. Like, should you go back and read old sci-fi? Should you go back and listen to those old bands recording? You know what I mean? Or should you just focus on the new stuff?
Right.
Do you really need to know what the background, where they came from? And that's your call, I guess. Yeah.
And you do
call.
you.
You do you.
You do you.
You do what you got to do.
That's what it's about. That's the summary here.
Exactly.
So I guess to wrap up in the way that we kind of always do, I think let's just ask the question: is this book of substance?
No.
I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
I am going to say yes. Is it just a one-word answer? Because I'm
think
already well over one word.
Maybe we should defend it. I don't know.
I think we kind of already answered it. It's almost better that it's black and white because this book is very black and white to me.
The listener has to make of it what they will.
Yeah. I'm also going to go with no. So it's like 2/3. You average it.
Okay.
It's like
is
it's a
that how
statistical thing.
Okay.
Just rub some science on it.
That's hard sci-fi.
That's hard. This is a hard sci-fi podcast episode, and you're welcome.
I actually, when I started reading this book, I was like, oh, I'm kind of into this. After The Dispossessed, which I hated, and the first part, it kind of reads like a adventure journal.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
It's like
a travel writer.
Like a travel writer, exactly. I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. This is kind of interesting. And so I recommended it to a coworker. I was like, oh, I don't know where this is going, but I think maybe it's cool. He asked me what I was reading. And then I got a little bit further, and I was like, I need to find John and tell him not to read this book.
Yeah. I know. I actually tried to cut some people off. I was like, don't do it. I'm really sorry. Well, so like that aspect, like the thing that I do think is cool about her is she seems self-aware of some of this stuff. And so there's another interview excerpt. So the guy goes, now that brings up something else. You have all these journeys in your fiction. People are always traveling around. That's a great way to see your geography, but it often becomes the plot. We all go on a journey, not always an ordeal or quest, but we always go on a journey. And she responds, you've just hit a very significant note here. Actually, I'm terrible at plotting. So all I do is sort of put people in motion, and they go around in a circle, and they generally end up about where they started out. That's a Le Guin plot.
I mean, the more you read her quotes, the more I like her.
I really like her.
She accidentally
became an author.
became this poster child for...
I think you're right, actually. And it's kind of interesting, like, what other books are out there that got lost, that maybe grapple with these themes that just didn't make it big. They've got to be out there.
Some of her interviews are great. She's like sharp, and she like one of these. I have a book called The Last Interview and Other Conversations with Le Guin. But one of them, she just like totally like fillets this guy. He like gets everything wrong, and she's just like right on. And I'm like, man, can you write your fiction like that, please?
One topic we didn't touch on was the religious, the Hadara, the facts. Basically, that giant orgy they had, or whatever that was, where they could the mind speak. We didn't touch on that. Right. Yeah, which to me meant nothing, and then like that did nothing.
Yeah, the mind speak. Why didn't they open that up? Why was that even there?
Yeah.
What did that? How did that tie in with ambisexuality? How did that tie in with shifgrethor? Like, what at all did that do? Other than, I mean, like, even as an idea is in science fiction, it's not. It's kind of neat to think about, but not. I mean, it's not really something that I ever see humans being able to do. Maybe so naturally.
You could have, or she could have. One might have contrasted shifgrethor, which is the art of not saying what you mean, and mind speak, which is the inability to not say what you mean.
And honestly, she fucking talks about that in these books too, and she talks about that as a mechanism and why it's a useful thing, but
it didn't happen.
It's not in the fiction.
Yeah. Dang, that would have been really interesting.
All I do is I read mind speak and I'm
together.
like, this is dumb.
Yeah.
See, so is she like a Philip K. Dick? Because Philip K. Dick throws these ideas out, and then you stumble through a book, and then somebody else picks it up and they're like, hey, I'll just rearrange these, put actual humans in here, and rewrite the story and make $1 billion movie.
You know what we should do is find the literature teacher at Berkeley High that taught both of them, and we'll
right.
And we'll figure out where their writing styles. Because apparently
they were just like they're like, so I found these mushrooms in the wood chips outside, and I think instead of reading today, we're just gonna chew on these and stare at the ceiling for a little while.
Just gonna work on ideas and not the crap.
Exactly.
Thanks for listening. As always, you can find us at booksofsomesubstance.com and on Twitter and Instagram with the handle booksosubstance.
I did want to say, I felt bad. I mentioned, I was like, well, it's great because she opened up the door for a lot of other, like she was being a woman in the 60s writing science fiction. And then I went on to list like all these male authors. So that's been in the back of my mind. I'm like, oh, goodness, Stephanie, that's
okay.
That was quite terrible.
I called feminists peasants.
Yeah.
You talked about the Spanish-speaking.
Portugal. They apparently speak Spanish now.
So essentially we have great credentials.
Yeah, we're smart. Oh man, yeah. Maybe.